Good evening and welcome to the Cambridge Union for our final debate of Easter term, and indeed my final debate as president. It's been a real privilege. Before we crack on with the debate proper, we have a slightly odd ritual to indulge in, if you'll permit us, which is the handover from the Easter team to the Michaelmas one. We'll do it in order of precedence for the society. So the first person that will be handing over their role will be Hattie Allison, our social events officer, who will be handing over to Jarly Packer of the Michaelmas team. So if everyone could give her a massive round of applause, thank you. Mate, come on. No. Handing over next will be our treasurer, Shoan Aldecoya, who will be handing over to Miles Keckwick as treasurer for Michaelmas 2017. So everyone, a massive round of applause for Shoan. Running out of adjectives at this point. The next to hand over is Mr. Jonah Sirks, our Speakers Officer, who will be handing over to Charles Connor for his return to Standing Committee and an office. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jonah Sirks. And handing over after him, the penultimate of our handovers this evening, Mr. James Byrne will be handing over to Andrea to be our Michaelmas term executive officer. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. James Byrne. And I just can't say how much of a privilege it's been to be the president of this society, but what I will say is that the next president really needs no introduction as someone that should have done this far earlier in their time at this university. Ladies and gentlemen, your president for Michaelmas 2017 is Miss Paige Naomi Satterthwaite. Have a great time. Thank you. Yeah, I'm good.
Thank you very much to Harry, and I'd just like to reiterate to the entire team, to James, Jonah, Shoan, Hattie, and Harry, we've had an absolutely incredible Easter term. I hope whether this is the very first event you've attended this term or one of many successful ones that you have really enjoyed the term, and this continues, the Easter team legacy continues into this weekend with Hattie's garden party, which I'm sure will be a great success, and I really look forward to seeing many of you there. But tonight, we do have the presidential debate. There is one person that I would like to briefly thank, someone who has very graciously introduced me, who has very graciously thanked the rest of his team, and has led a very successful term. Harry has been an excellent debating officer to this union, and then an excellent president, and it has been an honour to work alongside him. He set a very high bar for Michaelmas, and I would just like to thank him, and on behalf of all of us, if we could just give Harry a quick hand.
Thank you.
Now, Harry has done an incredible job, but nevertheless, he does deserve to be challenged, so please do pick up on the points that he makes tonight. Tonight, the motion before the House is, this House believes Britain is not great. It's particularly fitting at this time after the latest general election, as we may enter into another period of political uncertainty. We have an excellent lineup, and with two speakers aside tonight, we really hope to have a lot of engagement from the floor, so please do not be shy. For anyone who is unfamiliar with the format, you have the opportunity to engage either by making a point of information, just say point of information, or on that point, stand up, indicate to the speaker. It's basically an interruption, and they can either take your point or they can wave it down. It's absolutely up to them. Please just respect their time. There's also the opportunity to make a point from the floor. So after the first pair of speakers have made their speeches, I will ask for points in proposition, opposition, and abstention of the motion. Again, if you would like to make a point, please do just indicate. Both times, please wait until the microphone gets to you and state your name and college for the record. Finally, if anyone is listening on the live stream, I have checked the numbers, and a good number of you are, please do feel free to tweet in. The hashtag tonight is CUS Great Britain, and I have got the Twitter feed up here, so please do, and I'll try and read a couple of those out too. But without further ado, our first speaker on proposition tonight is Mr. Godfrey Bloom. Mr. Godfrey Bloom is an MEP, or was an MEP, for Yorkshire and Humber from 2004 and 2014. He's a former member of the Territorial Army, and Mr. Bloom has attracted significant media attention for his political views. It's an honour to have him here tonight. Mr. Bloom, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. It's my third time here, I think, and it's always a pleasure to come to Cambridge. It's an interesting proposition tonight, isn't it? Britain is not great. I'd like to just sort of kick this one around with you a little bit, because I think unless you are a celebrity BBC historian, nobody in the world would deny that Britain used to be great. And of course, I use the concept of great in its form for this debate. My old constituency used to distinguish Great Driffield from Little Driffield in the same way that we attained the designation great as Great Britain from Brittany in ancient times. So this isn't about great as we understand it in the terms of Alfred the Great or Alexander the Great. It was a geographical designation. But let's go with the flow here, because I think that's really what it's all about. It's not about a geographical designation. It's about, were we great, are we great today, will be great in the future. I think that's really what it's all about. I don't think anybody could possibly deny that Britain was not great. It had the greatest trading empire that the world has ever seen in the 19th century. And for those of you, I suspect now, rather too young as I look around, to get an atlas, a world atlas from 1930, a Phillips atlas of 1930, you'll see that an enormous amount of the globe was covered in red, and that made the British Empire. And of course, some of my fellow members of the Mises Institute as libertarians think this was not a good thing or indefensible. I don't accept that personally. And I think if you read Neil Ferguson's book, Empire, you'll find that the British Empire was a little bit like the curate's egg, good in parts. And it's worth having a look at. I know that it's not fashionable now to suggest that. And of course, history, sadly, is a matter of fashion like everything else, but I think international historians will look back and think that perhaps the British Empire was great in its way. And I don't use the word good, great, good. Have a look at that. I think it's worth some time rather than taking perhaps the BBC celebrity historian view, which is rather more about celebrity than it is of scholarship. Let's have a look a little bit about why perhaps Britain was great, if we accept it was great in the sense of Alexander the Great or Peter the Great or Alfred the Great. Let's just have a little look about why it was great and why that trading empire was built. And I would argue it was based on law. And if we look at law, if we look at the concept of law, and if we go back right back to 900 AD, we'll look at the time of Alfred the Great. we'll look at the concept of Saxon law. Saxon law. Common law. Common law. Judicial precedents, which of course we have given to most of the English-speaking world. Fascinating concept, because if you dig a little bit deeper, it's more of a localized type of law. It's that which you can't do rather than that which you may do, which is something that we see on the continent over the years, which has been corpus juris or Napoleonic code, which tells you that which you may do. And I think we have a much better system of law, the principles of English law, which is that which you may not do. And I think we're all very comfortable here, aren't we, with a few rules and regulations that we can't do. Rather than being told what we can do, and if you think that through, what we can do, corpus juris or the Napoleonic code, is very legalistic. And it's developed, hasn't it, since 900 AD? It's developed. We've had the concept of the principles of English law, and this is Cambridge. I don't need to explain the principles of English law to you, but if I may remind you, just perhaps for a moment, we have the presumption of innocence. We have trial by one's peers, latterly, much more latterly, historically, habeas corpus. We have all these things which have given the English-speaking world a system of law. And a system of law which even the Normans, when they came in 1066, accepted as being a very good system of law, because it understood the concept of the freedom of the individual and the concept of property rights. And the most important thing of all, in my view, is governance by consent. Governance by consent. And that's unbelievably important in my view. And that's what gave us the greatest trading empire that the world has ever seen. That concept of the principle of law, freedom of the individual, the acknowledgement of property rights. And that's what made a great nation. It was nothing to do with the state. The state produces nothing. The state, as we think today, now in 2017, the state wipes our body, doesn't it? It looks after our education, it looks after our welfare, it looks after our pensions, it looks after our health. But in the 19th century, it wasn't like that. We didn't have that sort of concept. We had a free society really up until the early 1950s, where I still remember people would say, oh, well, we live in a free country. That is something that you won't hear. The youngsters amongst you today won't hear that. We live in a free country. We don't live in a free country anymore. That stopped. And if you go back a little bit and you think of maybe perhaps Voltaire, you look about the Enlightenment, you look about these matters, and we were looked at by the continents with our Toleration Acts, the Bill of Rights. We talk about 1688, but this is Cambridge. I don't need to remind you about this because you know about these things. They need a bit of reminding at the other place. But I don't need to remind you about these things because your grasp on fact here is a lot stronger than perhaps those Oxford politicians that we've seen like Blair and Cameron, who seem to not understand our history. And of course we know, don't we, that Cameron actually on television in America could not communicate with his interviewer about the concept of Magna Carta. He couldn't tell you about Magna Carta. He couldn't tell you about these matters because he was at Eton and he was at Oxford. And it seems to me a place that's, if you want an education, both of those places are the last place to go. So we had all this. And I think the greatest of these concepts is governance by consent. And we were great, hence the Enlightenment, the advances in science, the advances in medicine, which we had. When the state had no impact on our lives, tax was relatively low, regulation was relatively low. It was for people, individual people, to bring the country forward, because it's never the state, it's individuals. So what went wrong? Why are we not a great nation now? And we're not. And this is the concept of the debate, isn't it? I'm very sadly sitting on this side that Britain is no longer great. And this I do with a very heavy heart. And we're not great now because we've got rid of our concept of law, the principles of law, the principles of individuals and freedom of individuals, that the Englishman's home is his castle. Every Tom, Dick and Jack in office from the town hall now can kick your door down. Mr. Jack in office can come into your house without a magistrate's warrant. We're no longer a free society. It's a state-driven society. And that means that we can't be great. It's a terrible shame. We cannot be great because we've taken away the freedom of the individual and the concept of property rights. When did it start? Well, I would argue it started probably round about 1914. The worst thing you can possibly do, is have a war. Warfare is desperately hostile to freedom of the individual. And in 1914, we had a great war. Lord only knows why. I don't know why we went into that particular war, but there we are, we did. And all of a sudden, all your great freedoms were taken away. And of course, we had another war in 1939, which of course was just an extension of the first one. It was part two of what was the first one. And I think that's a terrible shame. We have lost the concept of freedom of the individual. And it is the individual. It is the individual that makes a nation great. Any nation, not just our own. It is the individual that makes it great, not the state. The state does nothing for you except steal your money and give it to your clients. The client state, usually at the moment, banks. They steal money from old age pensioners in Wakefield and Pontefract. They suck it out like a vampire and give it to their buddies in the banking system. And that is the sort of thing that we need to stop. And until we do that, we won't be a great nation again. And I'll give you, just as I may just wind up on this, our problem that we have with the concept of representation and democratic representation. We are now regulated. We don't have recourse to English law. We are regulated. And the most evil invention we have under the concept of English law to circumnavigate it is regulation and the Enabling Act. The Enabling Act. So Mr. Jack in office at the town hall can cut a swathe through the principles of English law. And that is our problem. I'll leave you with just one example of that. I give way.
Just wanted to highlight a tension in your earlier argument. You're very upset about the Jack in office at the town hall being able to kick down your door, but then you were not really upset with the Jack in office at the Ministry of Defence being able to go to other countries and conquer them and kick down their doors. So why do you think that the empire is so great, and yet you reject the state that created the empire in terms of domestic affairs?
A very fair and good point, and if you read my books and my essays, you'll know I have been hostile to any form of military adventurism, for years. I got my dissertation, I graduated from the Royal College of Defence Studies on war aims, and I'm an ex-soldier. Any ex-soldiers here? Hands up. Any ex-soldiers? One. A Royal Marine, I know, Colonel. So, yeah, make no mistake, I just know about soldiering and I know about military adventurism, and I'd stop it tomorrow morning. You're absolutely right, and thank you for pointing it out. That's one thing I'd get rid of. But again, it's all about freedom of the individual, isn't it? And it started in August in 1914, didn't it? And in 1916, they made people go to war. They made people get into uniform to fight for some reason I don't actually know about at all, the Great War. It's always escaped me, although I'm an expert on it, and I've got more books than you can shake a stick at. Oh, I lecture on it all the time, but I still don't know why the bloody hell we got involved in that. 1 million war dead. I will not ever understand that. So you don't have to tell me anything about war as an ex-soldier. I know what it costs. And if you go to East Grinstead and you see people's legs blown off, as the Colonel here, Marines, knows, some of his friends have been in that situation from 42 Marine Commando. Why? And I'll tell you why if you want a piece of information. It's because we consistently follow United States policy and CIA policy to interfere in places which have nothing whatsoever to do with us. And that's because we no longer have freedom of the individual and freedom for independent thought like we had in the Enlightenment, the great advances that we have in the 19th century. The Enlightenment, medical advances, engineering advances. We all now, don't we, just look at the TV and assume that when we see Royal Air Force jets attacking the people who are trying to get rid of ISIS in Syria, and we go, oh, yeah, what's that all about? And we click over to see reality TV, or watch a few repeats of Dad's Army, or whatever it happens to be. You will not ever hang on to freedom of the individual and freedom of thought unless you understand it's a constant deal. You can't walk away from it. You can't go to sleep on it. Look back at our history for nearly 1,200 years. Every single year, every single decade, every single century, we have to be very careful about what we give away to politicians. And I can tell you, after 10 years in politics, every single politician I've ever met is a scoundrel, with the exception of myself. I commend you, sad-hearted, heavy-hearted, to this motion. Britain is no longer great, but it was great, and it could be great again if we concentrate on freedom of the individual. I commend the motion to you.
Thank you very much for opening the proposition tonight. And now going to the opposition. Opening for side opposition is Harry Stoven Bradford. He is the outgoing president of the union. He's also an English student at times at Fitzwilliam College. Harry.
Madam President, thank you so very much. Britain is a country that was forged in an act of union. It is a land renewed by the promise of the same every single day, of ever multiplying acts of union. It is a land set in the middle of a great ocean, to be found by a people from every corner of the earth who have a special love of opportunity, of peace, of prosperity. Britain is a country forged in the unions of people of every color, of every creed, coming here and finding the space to express themselves, the space to thrive according to what their own understanding of that word is. In as much as the freedom of the individual, I have very little to argue with Mr. Bloom about, but it is a land truly of the individual and of the individualized. And I would argue with what he says earlier about what the empire was like, because I would ask, in the past, I mean, who was so free? Because truly those who existed under our empire, did they have the ability to consent to be governed? Did they have the ability to live under the rule of law? The things that you say are so very important to our understanding of who we are as a people. I would doubt that quite significantly. I would suggest that perhaps those people were governed rather than part of a governing class. That seems to me unclear as a justification for empire. But nowadays, from the Masjid on Bricked Lane in London to Mousehole in Cornwall, one may find nowhere else on earth such diversity and such strength in that diversity. And whilst British people stand alone, we do so together. We come together in times of struggle, in times of national pain, and we together have the courage to say to our enemies, the same enemies that Mr. Bloom talked about, that there is a price this country will not pay. There is a point beyond which those enemies must not advance. And in that, one finds in that unity Britain's greatness. It is in ever-growing, ever-multiplying acts of union that Britain Britain's union was once between Scottish and English, and that Act of Union contained in it a long section about the complicated business of how one could tax Scotch whisky across a border that legally no longer existed, is beside the point. It's now a union of many smaller, but in no way less significant acts. It's a union that is cried out in English, in Polish, in Punjabi, in Urdu, in Bengali, Gujarati, Arabic, French, Cantonese, Spanish, Tamil, Somali, Lithuanian, and German, those languages which the census claims are now spoken in Britain by no less than 70,000 people each. And though those languages speak to an undoubted complexity of purpose and of culture throughout this country, they express a deeper harmony. Indeed, in the first two of those non-English languages that I just listed on that list, Polish and Punjabi, one finds the history of that cry from earlier, that there is a price we will not pay, there is a point which you must not advance beyond, and that continues to this very day. It's the same cry the number 303 Polish fighter squadron, who flew from not too far from this union, cried out. Pilots who flew in the Battle of Britain, who were so successful that the wartime censors would not allow reports of the damage they did to the Luftwaffe to be published, lest it lower British morale because of how more successful they were than British fighter pilots at that point. It is the cry of the war monument at Monte Cassino that commemorates 1,438 Indian servicemen who fell in the service of this and many other nations, of which 377 carried the surname Singh. It is unclear to me from the speech we've had so far from the proposition that those values of the last full measure of devotion, given by people who share different values to us, a different culture, but nonetheless an understanding of what it means to be British, and that Britain has a greatness that is worth fighting for. It is unclear to me those things do not exist today in those people that live in this country and continue to strive and to thrive according to their different conceptions of that word and to their different conceptions of what it means to be British, all brought together by a conception that there is something that this country offers, something that is great about Britain in its diversity, and that is something that we should celebrate. Britain's greatness is in its diversity of people, of purpose, of politics. Though separate, we are bound together in an uncommon effort, and we are raised from the material and the menial of modern life when, as Winston Churchill put it, great causes are on the move in the world, stirring all men's souls, driving them from their firesides, casting aside comfort, wealth, and the pursuit of happiness in response to impulses at once awe-inspiring and irresistible, and that in that we learn that we are spirits, not animals, and that something goes on in space and time and beyond space and time, which, whether or not we like it, spells duty. And that's the important thing, ladies and gentlemen, Madam President, to remember about Britain, is that at times we may doubt in its purpose, at times we may doubt in what it offers our society, but it stands for ideas already brought to us by the proposition, and those ideas ring out true today. Ideas of the rule of law, of the sovereignty of Parliament, things that are defended now, have been defended for hundreds of years, and will continue to be defended. Britain, irregardless of how it expresses those ideas, continues to express those ideas, and that is what makes it great. It is at a time just like that which Churchill describes that we find ourselves now. And I'm proud to report to this chamber and to you, Madam President, that I do not expect Britain to falter. We are faced by forces of division and forces of regressive social values in many different ways on many different fronts. But Britain will stand firm. We will come together from all corners of our nation and in the many different groups that comprise it for another great act of union, and that has already started. This generation, the generation most supported and most expressed in this chamber, will in short order express the promise and the obligations of this society and are the most tolerant, most forward-looking generation in the history of this or any other nation. This generation who, when confronted by the fury and anger of the attacks in Manchester and London, came not together in fury or in anger, but came together in song and in expressions with solidarity with those affected. Those who exactly a week after the London attacks encouraged each other to go out for a drink to say that our capital was open and that our nation was not afraid. Thus far, the battles that we fight may be smaller than those that Godfrey, as a former soldier, may have to have fought in. They may be fought on the streets of this country and in the hearts and minds of our countrymen and in those who would do us harm, as opposed to on the plains of Europe. But they are no less significant and no less say anything of what we are as a nation. They continue to cry defiantly that there is a price that we will not pay, and there is a line beyond which you, the enemies of our society, must not advance. And in that union that comes together in times of great national pain, one finds Britain's greatness. It is clear to me that we must trust in the promise of this nation and the promise of its manifold acts of union, from those expressed in law to those expressed in the solidarity of its people one to another. But more than that, we must trust in its cycles of history, the cycles that propel us forward and simultaneously call us back. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century, said of Britain's origins that we're a nation of refugees, that we are the sons of Brutus, who was himself the grandson of Aeneas, who was cast covered out in ashes and blood and tears from Troy, and found, as it fell to the Greeks, a new land, a new Troy on the banks of the Thames. This story speaks volumes to who we should be as a nation. It says that we should stand, be proud of who we are, of where we come from, and be willing to fight to the last man to defend this place and its values, that suggests that if you come here willing to subscribe to what we consider of the world, sovereignty of Parliament, of the will of the people to be able to express themselves and in government for the people, by the people, of the people, then you should be willing to be British, and that you are, more important than that, actually British. Those values may be hijacked by some less than savoury individuals and movements at a time, but I remain confident to the last that those individuals and those movements who hold those values truly reassert themselves time and time again in our history. It is in that story, our national legend, that has spoken so much of who we are as this nation. This telling of our greatness and how we conceive of it may change from person to person and from century to century, as new authors and new authorities assert and reassert it. But those same threads run through it, connecting us to a rich and living tapestry, from Alfred the Great to Edward the Confessor to William the Conqueror to Henry VIII and to the current day. Our expression of what equality under the law may mean, as we the people changes to include all the more people, all the more types of life to be expressed. But it is exactly the same right that was signed into law by King John at Runnymede in 1215, when it concerned only him and 25 rather truculent barons. The same law exists now. The we that it contains, the plural there that means our country and contains our country, is merely expressed to far more people, and that is something we can be enormously proud of, and is where Britain's greatness comes in. Britain is a nation of union, and in that union it has achieved great things, will achieve great things, and must achieve great things. But allow me at the end of this speech to pay tribute to another union, one that I've been president of for the last term. It too is much like our country. It has rather odd traditions. A leader who is questionably clinging on to power despite of mounting evidence that it's time for them to go and do something else. And it has a new generation coming to the fore that I must report to you, Madam President, I have nothing but confidence in. They will make us proud, we should trust in them, and I look with great excitement to your term in office and the terms in office of all the presidents of the Union, who I have no doubt are sat in this chamber. I have no doubt there are many of them. And I say to you, it has been the greatest honour of my life so far to serve as your president. And with that, I'm going to go sit with my family as a free man, no longer subject to the indentured servitude of being president of this society. Thank you all very much for this.
Thank you very much to Harry for an excellent opening to side opposition. It is now your chance to get involved in the debate as we go to a floor round. Please do remember to wait for a microphone and state your name and college for the record. First of all, does anyone have a point they would like to make in proposition? Oh, lots of hands. I'm going to go to the red top just there.
The opposition speaker has made a fantastic speech, and as a student of Fitzwilliam, I would expect no less. But the truth is that he's utterly deluded, or we are talking about a different country. He speaks about the government of the people, for the people, by the people. Is this the same government populated by Etonians, Oxbridge graduates, career politicians who have never done a normal day's work in their lives and who now are being rebelled against by the people? He talks about the sovereignty of Parliament, and yet we have exported our decisions to the EU, which now the people have rebelled against once more. The rule of law, and yet with legal aid cuts, some of the poorest people in our society are unable to access justice. And if you are at the lower end of the junior bar, you are genuinely better off on benefits. Ladies and gentlemen, we created these fantastic values, and now we have betrayed them. I'm sorry, but Britain is not great.
And now for a point in opposition of the motion. Yep, at the back there. And please state your name and college.
Keir Murison, Emmanuel.
Thank you.
Lots of issues that I take with the proposition, but I think the main one for me as a scientist was this basically dichotomy of saying, it's really bad that the state take cares of the NHS and our pensions and our education, and yet saying that the Enlightenment was so good with the advances in science and engineering. The biggest sponsor of science in the UK is the state. And that actually presents a freedom of individual unlike anything we've ever seen, because the money is not dedicated by the state to specific projects that it chooses. It gives the money to a funding body that then understands, reads the literature and understands the field, and then gives funding in that place. And to say that Britain is not great for that it is unable to understand that it's really good to fund science, but maybe it's not the best idea to have people in power to be the ones deciding where the funding goes, I don't think there is a better system out there. Because what that means is that we do progress, that we do say, okay, we're going to spend some of our taxation, and actually quite a lot of our taxation, which is good, to invest in our society and invest in science and move our society forward and move the world forward, but us ourselves, the people in power, are not to make that decision. And that kind of system has shown that Britain outperforms places like America, places like France, Germany, that have similar GDP in our scientific exploration. And I think that, out of anything as a scientist, is absolutely fantastic and means I'll probably have a job in later life, which is amazing as well. So for that reason, and that's just one of the issues I take with the speech, but I have to say that Britain really is great for that. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, is there a point in abstention of the motion? Yep, just in the black top there.
Good evening, Robert Gamage from Jesus College. I'd just like to ask on both sides how the issue of the large amount of in-work benefits will square on either side of this House, the fact that we've effectively subsidised below living wage labour. That's my first question. My second question, very briefly, is I'd like to invite Mr. Bloom and Mr. Hitchens out to the pub afterwards for a pint, if they'd be so kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And as there were quite a few points, it looked like, on the initial round, we'll just go round once more. So does anyone have another point in proposition of the motion? Yep, just at the back there. Yep.
Hi, I'm Kirill. I'm 15, so no college yet. So I just wanted to talk about foreign policy here, because whilst domestic policy is obviously important, foreign policy involves death in other countries. So I think we have to take that as actually being valid here. So a great country must be independent on the geopolitical stage, and I think we've already established with the first proposition speaker that we're kind of not, where in many ways we just follow America. And the second thing a great country has to be is it has to have a net positive impact. So in the British Empire, whilst we did bring slavery to colonies, we also brought civilization, we brought culture, we brought law to some extent. There are countries that would not be as advanced as they are without the British Empire, probably, obviously simplified right now. But there was a positive impact of the British Empire, clearly. But what about now? What does Britain do right now? Have we brought law, civilization to Libya? No, we brought it civil war. We brought its people death. It is currently in a state of of complete and utter destruction. And do we care? No. Most people, it doesn't appear on the news. We've ceased to care about it. And let's look at Iraq, same thing, a country that used to have stability, now it has death. Do we look at Syria, which we are still trying to destroy? We have brought death and destruction to the Middle East to an extent that cannot be justified and must give Britain the verdict of not being a great nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And a final point in opposition of the motion? Yeah, go ahead.
Nick So, Scomble Keys. Across the water, we heard a president standing for election saying that he wanted to make his nation great again. His idea of great, from everything we've seen, is to become once more the world's bully and the world's greatest polluter. The days of empire are gone, and I think we no longer want this nation to become great in that way. In fact, greatness is a much more subjective thing. It's nuanced, it's subtle, it's something that we feel within ourselves. I was born in this country, but I no longer live here. For many years, I was president of our alumni society in Perth, Australia, which is my home. We have nearly 200 alumni as our members. I know them all well. Several of them are here in the UK at the moment. I saw one here in Cambridge only yesterday. And if I were to put to our members this motion and say, how do you feel about Britain? Do you feel that Britain is great? I believe that their feelings for this nation, subtle and nuanced which they are, would bring a unanimous yes to that. So I actually carry the proxy votes of nearly 200 people, so we consider the motion to be carried anyway. I urge you to oppose the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, is there any final points in abstention of the motion? Something that you would like clarified or to hear? Yeah, just at the back there.
So being a Lebanese French student, I'd say Britain is quite great when it comes to culture, education. I came here because I thought Britain's education was great. I think people are very welcoming. I am very happy to be here. And I think I would say in that aspect of, as you said, local politics is quite great. But then if I look at international politics, would I actually agree with Britain? I would certainly not. As you said, Libya or the Middle East or all of these interventions were quite aggressive and did not bring any greatness to the Middle East or the countries they invaded. And they were very centered on Britain's interest. So yeah, I think it's all about the balance of having the local politics, which is, I would say, I'm really happy to be here and I wouldn't want to be in any other country at the moment. And I think Britain is great in that aspect. I've met very diverse people, I've met very interesting people, very different point of views. And I think this country has a lot to be proud of. But at the same time, maybe on an international level, it has so much less to be proud of.
Thank you, and I hope that the speakers in the closing half do address those points from the floor there. Now, to close side proposition, we have an author, an Orwell Award-winning journalist, Peter Hitchens. Peter Hitchens has argued for a variety of conservative positions, seeking redress to a perceived decline in the moral fabric of British society in past centuries. Peter, it's a pleasure to introduce you. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. As Sir Godfrey, I always think of him as Sir Godfrey.
I do myself.
I know you do. As he mentioned David Cameron in his speech, I feel I'm able to mention a piece of news about David Cameron, which has only recently become available, following the funeral of his former history teacher at Eton College. It turns out that before David Cameron left Eton, his teacher informed him that he knew less history than his dog. And I think this was demonstrated very much by the performance in office of that ungreat man whose departure from office I think very few people regret, and whose pictures of his own toes and those of his wife were an interesting contribution to the election campaign. On the question of greatness is quite complicated. One would, of course, be happy to see people deluding themselves about this country being great, just as sometimes one's happy to see people deluding themselves about how important they are or about how good they are at what it is they do when they're not really. It's kinder not to rouse them from their reverie and to tell them that they are mistaken. But in this case, perhaps there is something more important involved. First of all, there is this word great. It's not necessarily a compliment. I was thinking Cobbett's Great When, his description of the disgusting London of his time, the Great War, the Great Plague, the Great Fire of London, the Great Train Robbery, Great Russian Chauvinism, and the thing I travel on every day, which calls itself the Great Western Railway. And then there's that man who keeps saying they should make America great again. It doesn't advertise the word great to me as something necessary to be aspired to. But what are we actually dealing with here? We are dealing with a belief that we are somehow a country out of the ordinary, a country destined for great things, a country called upon all the time to achieve enormous things, to go particularly to war. And I have two texts I wanted to read to you. One is Sir Henry Tizard, who was one of the most brilliant military scientists of the Second World War, and who, amongst other things, fought against the very wicked policy of bombing German civilians during that war. He warned in 1949, "We are not a great power and never will be again. We are a great nation, but if we continue to behave like a great power, we shall soon cease to be a great nation." And also A.J.P. Taylor, I think the greatest historian in the English language in the past century, who wrote in his Origins of the Second World War in 1961, "Countries that have long been great powers shrink from admitting that they are great no longer." And I think this has been very much true in our case, and it will regrettably be true in the case of the United States as it sinks from its current eminence, as it seems to me to be bound to do, not only under its current leadership, but in general, this unwillingness to admit that you aren't as important as you think you are. Now, would this be such a bad thing? I regard myself as both an English and a British patriot. I love this country. I love every field and hedgerow. And it is a place which I have an immense and abiding affection for, and I sorrow to see the state to which it has come. It doesn't mean that I necessarily think that it is great. And one of the things that seems to me to be very troubling about this greatness is that it impels us repeatedly to imagine that our position is so important that we have to rush into actions of the kind that Henry Tizard was, I think, warning against in that minute which he sent in 1949, round about the time that Ernest Bevin, the Labour Foreign Secretary, infuriated by the humiliating way in which he'd been treated by Burns, the Secretary of State of the United States at the time, insisted to the cabinet that Britain had to have a nuclear weapon, not actually to defend ourselves against the Soviet Union, but to show the Americans that they weren't boss. That was the reason why we did it, an illusion of continued greatness following a war in which we had bankrupted ourselves. Was this policy wise or sensible? Now, many people looking back on British history will say, well, of course, the peak of our power and greatness was the Victorian era. And many of them will turn to the great Lord Palmerston as perhaps supposedly the most perfect example of gunboat diplomacy, of the assertion of British power and greatness throughout the world. And yet, in 1864, Britain had given to Denmark a pledge that it would go to Denmark's assistance if Denmark were attacked by what wasn't then Germany, was the German Confederation and Austria, over the issue of Schleswig-Holstein, which all of you will know. Palmerston said that only 3 people understood it. One was dead, one had gone mad, and he had forgotten. But actually, he was dissembling. He knew perfectly well what it involved. It involved Britain giving a pledge to defend Denmark against German aggression, which he wriggled out of when the moment came, saying, "I'm terribly sorry, we only have a navy, we don't have an army, it's the winter and it's cold and we're not coming and you can shift for yourselves." And he handed Denmark over to the fate which then followed, which was that Germany stole Schleswig-Holstein from Denmark. And you would think, wouldn't you, given that we make out that we're such a great country and that we dominate Europe, that this tremendous surrender and retreat would be marked in the annals of British history, remembered by everybody, known by everybody, as the moment when we stepped down from our position as great power. As it happens, almost nobody's even heard of it. If we'd only taken the same view in 1914, we would have saved ourselves, in my view, a great deal of trouble. Instead of taking that view in 1914, we moved from being a creditor nation to a debtor nation, and we moved from being a significant and rich country with a long and prosperous future ahead of it to a bankrupt, constantly seeking subsidies from other people and becoming eventually the pensioner of the United States. Please.
Had Prince Philip not changed his last name, and had, for a variety of reasons, Winston Churchill not told the Queen to keep her last name, the name of the ruling house of this country would be Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg. Is it not clear, therefore, that greatness, as I've argued and as other people in this chamber have, is not something that transforms and changes, and it may not be seen in the same form later that it is previously, but as opposed to that being a dereliction of duty, which is what you're describing it as now?
Well, it was a dereliction of duty, but it was a very sensible one. Had we gone to war against Germany in 1864, just as had we gone to war against Germany in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War, when our treaty with Belgium might have impelled us to do so, another complicated story, we would have been defeated and ruined. As it happens, we did neither. On the point of Schleswig-Holstein and British titles, I'm reminded of Kaiser Wilhelm II's joke on the occasion when the British royal family changed its name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor. He looked forward to a performance of Shakespeare's play The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha at the earliest opportunity. These names are of no real significance. The point that I'm making is that the more you imagine that you're important, the more foolishly you behave. Since we sank completely into our dotage of delusion after 1945, when we actually were completely an American pensioner, bankrupt, our entire life savings sent to the United States in convoys of gold, no money left at all, but a nuclear power. And it was at that point that we committed some of the greatest follies of our existence. The 1956 conspiracy with France to attack Egypt at Suez, possibly the most disastrous foreign policy mistake ever made by any major country, removed us permanently from the position of important nation. We learned nothing from it. When the Americans approached us for help in their adventure in Iraq in 2003, we rushed into it with the same verve, vigor, and stupidity that we'd used at Suez, and made a mistake even more disastrous from the point of view of the world, not so directly disastrous from the point of view of us, turning the Middle East into a furnace of horror, which it still is, and entirely, in my view, joining in this folly because of delusions of greatness, which we still had, delusions of grandeur, as you might call them, in an individual. We've subsequently done the same thing, as the speaker over there mentioned, in Libya, where we turned a nation which was at least stable and reasonably peaceful into a cauldron of violence and chaos from which it may never, ever emerge again. And actually, at that point, stimulated the mass migration into Europe, totally uncontrolled, which is causing a crisis whose end nobody can see. And we then intervened at the behest of Saudi Arabia, again imagining that we were great, in Syria, a country, again, stable and reasonably prosperous, which we have destabilized, turning millions of formerly happy human beings into refugees and tens of thousands of them into corpses. Again, the delusion of greatness, the delusion of grandeur. I would love this country to be an important country. I would love this country to be a civilized country. I would love this country to be a free country, a good country, and a just country. Many of the things about it which I grew up to love and admire, have vanished in my lifetime. Our unarmed police force has gone, and now we see men with submachine guns patrolling the streets. Jury trial, which we boast of, has been eviscerated by majority verdicts. What happens in that great film, 12 Angry Men, where one brave juror stands up against a majority determined to convict an innocent man, could not now happen in this country because of this. The right to silence is gone. Habeas corpus is under attack. Under anti-terrorism law, people can be locked up without trial for immense periods of time, which will doubtless be lengthened soon. Many of the things for which we used to stand have been quietly demolished. Our education system, I regret to say, has also been eviscerated. And we are not, I'm afraid, great either domestically or in foreign terms. Now, if we do not recognize this, the decline will continue and continue. the more we continue to indulge ourselves in these delusions of grandeur and these beliefs that we are important, the less we will do to attend to the real problems of this country. And that's why it is such a mistake, and it is why any patriotic person who loves this country and feels that it is, in many ways, as has been in the past, an example of justice and liberty to the world, should be very wary of accepting drum-banging, flag-waving, noisy, song-singing patriotism of the kind that says, oh, Britain is great, let's make Britain great again. Let's make Britain good again. That would be enough. I would urge you, please, to vote for the motion. Thank you very much.